Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. Last week, South Korea and the United States released a joint fact sheet detailing breakthroughs in security, defense, and trade. South Korean President Lee Jae Myung called it a renaissance in bilateral ties, while Washington framed it as a historic strategic shift. Nuclear-powered submarines, boosted defense spending, and key trade wins like semiconductor protections are just the beginning. Following this, President Lee today launched a diplomatic tour of Africa and the Middle East, expanding South Korea's outreach beyond the U.S. China sphere. To help us break down what all this means, we connect to Ban Kil Joo, assistant professor at the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. A big welcome.
Hello, good to be with you.
And also joining us is Daniel Connolly, associate professor of international relations at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Good to see you.
Great to be here.
So, Professor Ban, let's first begin with the release of the fact sheet. President Lee Jae Myung called the results as the opening of a new renaissance in the South Korea-U.S. alliance, while U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Orlando hailed it as a historic agreement that opens a new chapter in the alliance. How do you assess the overall impact of this agreement on the direction and role of the alliance moving forward?
Well, to put it simply, this joint fact sheet is better placed to make the ROK-US alliance more symmetric, although there are still follow-up measures ahead. Before going for a deep dive on the joint fact sheet, we need to take a snapshot of the security environment around the world. The previously working formula is dysfunctional, as we can see in the loosening rules-based order. In the meantime, the alliance formula is on a different track as well, particularly in a situation where the Trump administration attempts to include a very real-looking variable, which is a deal even in alliances. So the concept of alliance modernization serves as a typical example of the changing status in the alliance formula. When those factors are taken into consideration, alliance risks are on the rise around the world. With this in mind, the joint fact sheet shows that alliance risks have been addressed, at least for the time being, in the ROK-US alliance. First, the joint fact sheet shows that South Korea will put more effort into enhancing its capability to defend itself, but at the same time, USFK, U.S. Forces Korea will continue to define deterring North Korea as its primary mission. Second, both sides agreed to maintain the 2006 strategic flexibility, which means the USFK will not be dispatched for missions off the Korean Peninsula without consultation with South Korea. Third, South Korea and the United States clarified the win-win items such as cooperation in shipbuilding and nuclear power. In particular, new items that have never been made before appeared in the joint fact sheet, which includes nuclear power submarines as well as uranium enrichment and spent fuel reprocessing, obviously related to 123 agreement. This last item contributes to making the alliance architecture more symmetric than before. All in all, I would say that the joint fact sheet not only helps address alliance risks, but also serve as a stepping stone for the ROK-US alliance to evolve into a symmetric alliance. In the meantime, alliance management should continue to go on in the sense that Trump's negotiation formula is repetitive and endless, and the United States national security strategy has not been laid out yet.
Right. So, Professor Ban, thank you for the overall picture of the latest deal. Of the many outcomes that you've mentioned, let's point out on the key outcome, which was the U.S. approval for South Korea to build nuclear-powered submarines. So, strategically and politically, Professor Connolly, what does this approval actually mean for South Korea?
Well, I think it's highly significant because only 6 countries currently operate nuclear submarines. Australia is on a kind of a long-term pathway to getting them, and now South Korea. So definitely in terms of status in the international system, it's a huge deal. But I do think some of the long-term consequences might be a little more mixed than some of the more exuberant supporters of the plan believe. And I would like to identify 3 issues in particular, looking long-term. first, these submarines are not as useful against North Korea as sometimes people talk about them. You don't need nuclear submarines to deal with North Korea's navy, which is essentially a brown water navy with small patrol vessels. Really, you just need more anti-submarine capability. I think nuclear submarines represent a global force projection capabilities that are much more useful for projecting South Korean sovereignty in the world oceans. And this, of course, does alarm Russia, does alarm China, and it does raise kind of dangerous questions about South Korean foreign policy in the future. Because once you have a capability, then there's a greater chance the US is going to ask you to use it in a context that you may not want to. And I think this was really exemplified by the U.S. Chief of Naval Operations, who recently visited Korea and said, and this is a quote, utilization of that submarine to counter China, I think, is a natural expectation. So the U.S. side may ask Korea to use this in ways that the South Korean officials may not want to. Second, I think the problem of fuel. The Chinese use low enriched uranium in their submarines. The US and the Australian submarines currently being developed use highly enriched uranium, which is a very kind of a stepping stone to nuclear weapons. I think for the case of the South Korean submarines, which type of reactors are they going to use? If they use a US design with highly enriched uranium, that's going to call into question some of South Korea's anti-proliferation credentials. And lastly, we have to think about the broader changes to the future of war going on right now. If you look at the war in Ukraine, cheap disposable maritime drones are proving to be very successful at destroying expensive warships. A lot of innovation in cheap digital sensors that you can basically scatter over the ocean. So I think in narrow waters like the East Sea and the West Sea, a nuclear submarine may be very vulnerable. So again, this is something that's not going to be used in a North Korean contingency. And ultimately, I worry South Korea might be like a country building battleships in 1939 on the eve of Pearl Harbor when a cheaper weapon rendered this expensive device obsolete. So militarily, I do have some questions about the long-term practicability. Politically, though, it's a huge coup for the South Korean government.
Right. So behind this very big decision, there seems to be some underlying concerns and also uncertainties as well. And aside from what Professor Connolly mentioned, there are other concerns about the fact sheet omitting crucial details on whether the submarines will be built and where the submarines will be built and how the nuclear fuel will be supplied, actually. So the Korean government has long pushed for domestic construction. We are aware of that. Professor Ban, what's the outlook for follow-up negotiations on these missing elements?
To be honest with you, details on the nuclear power submarine program had better not be included in the joint fact sheet because it takes more than 10 years to be accomplished, which means uncertainty remains in the future process. Too many details could lead to friction between the two in the process later on. Since the two sides agreed on the basic policy of South Korea's nuclear power submarines, I believe that the joint task force will work anytime soon in order to tackle the detailed items. I believe that follow-up negotiations should consider the two key variables. First, taking advantage of South Korea's world-class shipbuilding capability, and second, leading this program to create synergy for the MESGA project. In this regard, the main construction should be made in South Korea because this way is advantageous for both cost effectiveness and the time to be fielded. Meanwhile, the scenario that the final process for submarine construction will be made in the United States could be under review as one of the possible options, which include lowering nuclear fuel in submarine platforms as part of an effort to make the MESGA philosophy viable. Furthermore, constructing the third and fourth submarines in the United States could be included as one of the options under the condition that South Korea will proactively join the program to build ROK-US submarines. This option is expected to not only enhance the Basca project, but also expand K shipbuilding to the world.
Exactly. So the missing details are as important, and they could actually determine how fast or how far this actually would pursue. Now, taking it a little bit further, Professor Connolly, like you've mentioned, the fact sheet also opened the door for cooperation on uranium enrichment and spent fuel reprocessing. Though you've mentioned some concerns a while ago, what do you think is the significance of this latest development? And also, realistically, what hurdles are still remaining?
Right. Well, I think South Korea's ambition to have an independent fuel cycle is arguably as important, if not more so, than the nuclear submarine ambition. And if you recall, in the kind of the lead up to APEC, President Lee first asked for permission to engage in uranium enrichment for the purposes of building nuclear submarines, and then Trump kind of said you can build nuclear submarines. I think because an independent fuel cycle really helps the competitiveness of South Korea's civil nuclear industry. So this has not only a high amount of status, but also export markets and economic potential. Whereas sinking a bunch of money into expensive nuclear submarines is not as much of an economic benefit as a civilian nuclear industry. I do think there's some problems though, because South Korea's nuclear industry is very competitive. The United States is also trying to export reactors. There's an era of hunger for electricity with AI. So I think South Korea's mastery of the fuel cycle will give it an advantage in exports, especially to the Middle East and Europe. But the United States, I think, envisions a much more of a traditional relationship where South Korea is gradually expanding its independent fuel cycle, but not as a competitor to the United States. And I find it's quite interesting that there is a recent U.S. fact sheet on the bilateral 123 agreement was uploaded on the State Department's website earlier this year. And it even has a little kind of a paragraph talking about how they imagine a situation where the U.S. provides the fuel to South Korea. South Korea continues to provide reactor components. They see it much more of this kind of symbiotic relationship rather than South Korea being a fully independent nuclear power. So I think even in the US, there's a lot of debates amongst the different departments, the different policymakers on how quickly they want South Korea to progress in this civil uranium enrichment. And the fact sheet is quite vague about the timing and how quickly this will happen.
Right, definitely. So it will be very important to watch how the two countries would sort out the differences in terms of perspectives and interests as well. Now, let's switch gears a little bit to defense modernization as well. So the fact sheet also outlines substantial upgrades in military cooperation. Professor Ban, South Korea is committed to raising its defense spending to 3.5% of GDP, and Washington expressed support for transferring wartime OPCON. How would you evaluate these defense and security-related agreements?
Well, the issue of modernizing ROK-US alliance shows how negotiations work when dealing with the Trump administration. In general, many items are included in the alliance modernization, ranging from the size of USFK to strategic flexibility and special measures agreement. However, those items have not been raised this time seriously when it comes to the alliance modernization. So the question is, what is the reason behind? I would say that South Korea's proactive intention to increase its defense spending to 3.5% of its GDP helped prevent other items on the alliance modernization from being raised on the table. As the United States demands alliance modernization, South Korea raises the future-oriented comprehensive strategic alliance. Those two look similar, but there are some differences as well. South Korea is eager to enhance the scope of its authority in the combined defense architecture. The transition of wartime operational control contributes to enhancing the level of its authority. Meanwhile, the OPCON transition should lead to enhanced defense readiness, not weakened one. To that end, a conditions-based OPCON transition plan should continue to work. Both sides promise to pay more attention to OPCON transition, but at the same time, they reconfirm the condition-based plan. In this vein, I would say that the agreement on the upcoming transition helps reduce the differences in alliance perspective between South Korea and the United States.
That will be a great scenario that we're going to look forward to. Now, meanwhile, switching gears again, starting today, President Lee is embarking on a diplomatic tour to 4 nations in Africa and the Middle East. Professor Conley, how do you interpret this move as part of South Korea's strategy to kind of diversify beyond its traditional partner-focused foreign policy?
Oh, absolutely. I think in this world where Trump and I would say future U.S. presidents are probably going to continue to act much more arbitrary than they have in the past, it's very important for middle powers like South Korea to diversify away from too much of a reliance on the U.S. market, maybe even too much reliance on the U.S. kind of diplomatic apparatus. So if South Korea succeeds in demonstrating its leadership independently of the United States, it's going to open up a lot of deals and a lot of trade opportunities. And if you think about South Korea right now, it's kind of embracing a closer relationship with the United States and elevating itself, as Professor Ban just said, more authority in the context of the U.S. alliance system. But I think South Korea needs to balance this elevation vis-a-vis the United States and Japan in their military alliance with the perceptions of the rest of the world, and especially developing countries, non-aligned countries. South Korea doesn't want to look too much like a U.S. Kind of, I don't want to use the word puppet. North Korea always says that. But still, I think South Korea needs to show that it is willing to do multilateral diplomacy. It's willing to be a reliable trading partner, even in a world where the hegemons are increasingly unpredictable and unreliable.
Right, it's indeed a bold pivot, especially at a time when global alignments are getting even more complex lately. Now, on the cultural front, the presidential office said that during President Lee's trip, it aims to position major Middle Eastern countries as hubs for K-culture, expanding cultural exchanges as well. Beyond economics and security, what is the strategic value of cultural diplomacy, and how much real impact can it actually generate, Professor Ban?
Well, K-diplomacy has been strongly supported by the 2 assets. First one, global Korean companies, and second one is K-culture or Korean wave. Meanwhile, the current ROK government seeks diplomatic expansion as shown by policies like global responsible power diplomacy and G7 plus diplomacy. In this sense, the current ROK government is more motivated to take advantage of K-culture, which has already been embedded around the world. Likewise, South Korea suggested CCI's culture and creative industries and included them in the Gyeongju Declaration at the end of the APEC summit. I believe that K-culture, which is embedded around the world, motivated South Korea to proactively suggest this item. How helpful is cultural diplomacy in the real world? I would say that cultural diplomacy is strategically advantageous in 2 ways. First, soft power. Second, public diplomacy. First of all, if diplomacy is effective in the long-term perspective, a country needs to be armed with not only hard power, but also soft power. The reason why the United States has been able to maintain its leadership around the world in the post-war era is that its soft power was recognized in the world, in addition to its military and economic supremacy. Second, public diplomacy as well as government diplomacy matters because the public serves as a meaningful player in supporting policies related to specific countries. Since K-culture contributes to a pro-Korean sentiment in general rather than anti-Korean sentiment, it helps enhances public diplomacy.
Right, so culture, of course, is soft power too, and it's going to be a long game strategy that has a lot of influence, of course. Now, before we let you go, President Lee is also scheduled to attend the G20 summit in South Africa on November 22nd, and the summit will focus on solidarity, equality, and sustainability as well. Professor Connolly, what kind of role and messages could we actually expect from the South Korean president on that global stage?
Right. Well, I think President Lee will be quite happy because President Xi and Trump are not there. Maybe a little more relaxing than his experience in the APEC summit, where he had to be undoubtedly very concerned about the meetings and what was going on. But more profoundly, I think the fact that the presidents of China and the United States are not there is an opportunity for South Korea to demonstrate some of this leadership. I've heard there are rumors that the United States during the working groups has been particularly intransigent, and there are some rumors that maybe a joint statement is going to be very difficult to arrive at all. In this kind of situation, I think it's a good chance for South Korea's delegates, President Lee himself, to demonstrate that he's willing to engage in multilateral diplomacy, that maybe he can help contribute to some sort of joint statement, or at least in trying to bridge the U.S. with the other sides. And specifically, I think the South African presidency, they have a task force on artificial intelligence, data governance, and innovation for sustainable development. I think this is particularly an issue that President Lee's domestic and international agenda really is congruent with. So if it is a very kind of hostile environment there, I think he can at least definitely contribute a lot to this much safer topic. And at the end of the day, I think it's a really sad reflection on the state of multilateralism in today's world that simply by showing up and being cooperative, President Lee can score a win compared to the countries that aren't even there at the G20 this time.
Right, so it will definitely be a critical global platform, and let's hope for South Korea to, show some real leadership in that stage moving forward. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Connolly.
My pleasure.
And Professor Ban, of course, we really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.